Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining TransCelerate's webinar, Quality Risk Management Framework, Best Practices for Implementation of Risk Management within the Clinical Development Space. Joining us for today's webinar are members of our TransCelerate QMS team. We have Alisa Super on the line. She is the head of Quality Risk Management at Pfizer. Alisa is also the QMS Initiative co-lead and was the lead author on the QMS Risk Management paper that was published earlier in 2019. Also on the phone today is Alan Chow. Alan is a Senior Manager of Quality and Compliance Risk Management at Amgen. Alan is also a key member of our QMS team and was an author also on the Risk Management paper. My name is Gloria McHugh. I am a webinar operations lead and a project manager for TransCelerate. If you have any feedback or technical issues during today's webinar, please send an email to events@transceleratebioPharmainc.com and we'll try to get that resolved offline. So in terms of logistics for today's webinar, all participants will be muted for the call. You should be able to use either your phone or a computer to listen to the audio. And I would like to suggest that if you have any audio issues that you hang up and try the other method. In many cases, that can help resolve any audio issues you may be having. GoToWebinar provides a control panel for you to use for a variety of tasks. And you can reduce that control panel for a better view of the presentation by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right. We're going to be using the questions panel for you to submit any questions that you have today. So you'll type your question into the questions panel and then click send to submit that. And we'll be addressing those during a Q&A session. We will also be using live polling for today's session to make sure that we are facilitating sharing and making the session interactive. All of our polling is voluntary and all of your responses will be completely anonymous. They'll just be shared as part of a percentage of respondents. So we have a test poll to make sure that our polling function is working and that you can hear me okay. So you should see a blue screen and you can go ahead and select the answer to your question. What is your favorite color? Pretty easy for today's webinar, testing out our functions. So thank you. It looks like already about 70% of the people on the phone have answered the question. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I'll then share the results. So thank you. It looks like 57% of people on the phone today, blue is their favorite color. So thanks everyone for participating and helping us test that. So we'll go back to the slides now. I'd also like to cover some ground rules. We want to make sure that the discussion is helpful and that we can answer as many questions as we can. So a couple quick ground rules. Again, participation in today's webinar is completely voluntary and also using any TransCelerate asset or tool is voluntary. You don't have to identify what company you work for. Specific topics that we would ask you not to discuss are any vendors, sites, or CROs that you are using or not using. Any challenges you've had with any vendors, sites, or CROs, please don't discuss your long-term development plans or anything related to costs. And we cannot answer any specific questions about vendors, costs of using or implementing TransCelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using the assets or tools. So the agenda for today's webinar, I'll spend a few minutes covering an overview of TransCelerate and our TransCelerate QMS framework. Alisa Super will cover an overview of the risk management framework for the majority of the session, and then we'll pause and do a short Q&A. And then Alisa will also cover the risk library and risk management example, and we'll finish with a Q&A and a short audience poll. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording and slides will be made available to all registered participants, and it will also be posted on the TransCelerate website, which is available to anyone. So getting into an overview of TransCelerate and the QMS framework. TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration across the R&D ecosystem. Our shared vision is to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the research and development of innovative new therapies. TransCelerate was founded in 2012 with 10 member companies and 5 initiatives. A major milestone was reached in 2016 when BioCelerate, a subsidiary, was founded, which is a focus on preclinical research. And today we have 20 member companies, Regeneron being the most recent member, and we have more than 25 initiatives, including 5 in the pharmacovigilance space. The breadth and depth of our solutions are really helping to enhance industry collaboration, and our long-term vision is to help facilitate future platform trials. More than 12 of our initiatives deliver solutions that really help to facilitate platform trials for the future. Additionally, we have TransCelerate, which is a platform to enable data sharing. The reach of our global membership is continuing to expand. As I said, we have 20 member companies, and at any given time, we have more than 1,000 people from member companies that help to design and develop those TransCelerate solutions. So it truly is a collaboration across a large portion of the R&D space. Our presence and impact as well as engagement is worldwide. We have an expansive country network spanning 30 countries, and again, those are member company representatives helping to design solutions as well as implement them for their member companies. And we've also engaged with 13 regulatory authorities around the world on a variety of our initiatives to make sure that we're getting input from the regulatory authorities as we work. Getting now into an overview of the TransCelerate's Clinical Quality Management System framework. The purpose of the Clinical QMS is to provide an integrated framework through which organizations can systematically define their quality objectives, linking to their broader strategic goals. The TransCelerate framework should help to efficiently achieve an organization's quality and organizational objectives. It will help reduce recurring quality-related issues that undermine patient safety and data integrity and also consume valuable resources. It should increase confidence in clinical research and its results. And importantly, it is designed to integrate individual trial-level quality and risk management activities to provide a more holistic view of whether the clinical quality objectives are being met and if the risks to subjects and data quality are appropriately being addressed across the enterprise. The TransCelerate QMS system is a framework that is designed to be more at the R&D enterprise level above the trial level of activities for risk. This is a diagram that visually displays the QMS framework that was published. These elements were developed through our research and interviews as we were creating the framework back in 2016, and these elements were reported to contribute to success in the clinical area. You can see the 7 horizontal blue bars that are the 7 elements that help to integrate quality into clinical development activities. You can also see at the bottom of the diagram, there are 4 elements that provide foundational aspects. These are for an organization to understand the context of the QMS in relation to their organization, leadership commitment to quality, organizational commitment to quality, and of course, continual improvement of the QMS framework. Additionally, you can see the 2 white bars on the right are elements that provide ongoing monitor of the achievement of quality objectives and the performance of the QMS. TransCelerate's QMS framework is designed to be proactive, risk-based, and flexible, and all of these elements and foundational aspects are designed to work together like a system of gears work together to drive a car. As the TransCelerate team was developing their QMS framework, ICH E6 R2 was also being published in late 2016. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone's aware that there's a lot of the QMS framework elements that align with the requirements of E6 R2. So this table is designed to show you how things line up. So you can see on the left side, the ICH E6 R2 language specifically related to Section 5 and subsections within Section 5. And then the middle column is the CQMS element that can help sponsors implement QMS elements that can help with the ICH E6 R2 requirements. And then on the right, we also have selected tools. We have a number of operational tools that are available to sponsors to help with some of these implementation and ongoing continuous improvement of the QMS framework. Specifically, assessing the CQMS tool is designed to help sponsors really take a look across all of the elements and see how enable them to assess and see how their elements are working together or where they could use improvement. We also have tools for assessing the clinical knowledge management space and a toolkit for implementing processes. And again, all of these tools are available on the TransCelerate website. So taking a deeper dive into the CQMS elements, as I said, the overall framework was published in 2016. The conceptual paper, which included definitions and descriptions of all the elements and foundational aspects, was published in 2016 with additional supportive tools in 2017. Then we took a deeper dive into the issue management element, which was a manuscript published in July of 2016 and supportive tools available in 2017. Both of these papers also have Chinese translations available on our website. We took a deeper dive then into knowledge management with a manuscript in September of 2016 and additional tools available in 2017. And we also have this assessing the CQMS tool, which is a tool designed to help operationalize the CQMS within a sponsor company. That's been available since September of 2017. And we also took a deeper dive into risk management, which of course is the focus of today's webinar. This manuscript was published in January of this year, and supportive tools were made available in March. And lastly, we also have a processes manuscript that was also published in January. Tools were available in March, and we have a webinar on that scheduled for October, which is also, you can register for that on our website. And we have more than 28,000 downloads. Many of these manuscripts have been published through the DIA Tiers Journal and are available on our website, and all of this is available to industry. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alisa Super, Head of Quality Risk Management at Pfizer, to walk us through the risk management framework. And I'd also like to just remind you that you can go ahead and type your questions at any time into the questions panel and click submit or send to send those over, and Alan and Lychee will be monitoring those. Melissa?
Thanks, Gloria. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on quality risk management for clinical development. Gloria, you can go to the next slide. I'm Alisa Super, and the lead author of the recently published TransCelerate manuscript on quality risk management for clinical development. You get a little snapshot of it here, but that is available, as Gloria said. It's been published and is publicly available. Before we dive into our topic today, we have two quick polling questions for you to make sure we're focusing our conversation for the right audience. So the first one that Gloria just popped up on the screen is, how aware of the TransCelerate risk management manuscript and tool are you? And if you could quickly answer that one, and when it looks like most of the responses are in, Gloria will share the results with us. All right, so thanks. That's really helpful, and it helps me to understand where to focus the discussion today. So that's great. And then we have a second question. Again, we'll try to do that relatively quickly. So as quickly as you get your answers in, to how mature do you consider risk management in your organization? All right, great. So it looks like the majority of folks may have some familiarity with the manuscript, some may not, and that most programs are somewhat mature, but we do have a mix. So thank you for that. Thanks for your quick answers there. And with that, we'll move into the topic of quality risk management for clinical development. So we thought it was important to start with an understanding of why risk management should be applied to quality in clinical development, beyond the regulations and really underlying the regulations of preventing issues. So in order to do that effectively, the risk management program needs to help you understand what the most significant quality risks are for your organization, to which risks should controls be allocated, and that's really where resourcing comes into play, and are the controls applied to those risks effective? So those are the three things we're really trying to get out of a risk management program. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these in the framework that TransCelerate companies see as best practice in supporting the answers to these questions. But first, on the next slide, we need to clear up some misconceptions. So in the development of the manuscript and within our own companies, as we started to share broadly our thoughts about risk management with the industry, we encountered three major misconceptions. First, that the quality management system is the same as risk-based monitoring. And I think because discussions of these two topics have happened in parallel, there's some confusion about the difference between a quality management system, which is a more comprehensive and holistic view of quality across trials, programs, and really for a company in the clinical development space, compared to risk-based monitoring, which is more focused on the specific resource allocation in the monitoring space. And if you think about monitoring as one of the controls that we use in our processes to make sure that things are going well, monitoring is really catching things after they've already happened, right? So in order to detect something at monitoring, at least in its current state, we're typically looking for things that have already gone wrong and applying a control after the fact. So that's a very specific application of a risk-based approach, right? The risk-based part is focusing resource on the areas that matter most, but it's not a comprehensive QMS that we see across all of clinical development. Similarly, our second misconception that we ran into a lot was that risk management is the same as risk-based monitoring. And similar to the prior discussion, risk management is a more comprehensive look at risk. It's meant to look proactively, so to get to things before they become issues, and can be risk-based in its nature, but is not the same as risk-based monitoring. Again, risk-based monitoring is focused on that resource allocation on the monitoring side. It may include things like centralized monitoring analytics, and being part of the overall QMS can inform other elements of it, but isn't usually that comprehensive look at a clinical trial from a proactive perspective that we get with risk management. And last but not least, the confusion between risk management and issue management is an important one to overcome. If we're looking at issue management, we're talking about things that have already happened. And it's the corrective and preventative actions that you put in place in response to those things that are part of that issue management process. Risk management, we want to be looking proactively before something goes wrong to see how we can prevent it. It may also connect to issue management, right, as part of the QMS. That's why we call it a system, because the parts are connected. And that connection may be things like, well, we put the CAPA in place, but there's still some residual risks that we're worried about. Or we have trends and issues that amount to a larger risk. So there's a relationship between them, but they certainly are distinct, and that issue management is around things that have already happened, and risk management is on that proactive side of things. Next slide.
Melissa,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's some questions coming in that perhaps the slides are not being shown. So I just unshared and shared my screen again. Can everyone see? I guess Leachy and Alan, can you see the perceptions versus reality slide?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Sounds like we are resolved with the technical issues. Okay, Melissa.
Yeah, and Gloria, I could see it the whole time, but I would just encourage people, if you can't see it, please let us know. Send us something in the chat. All right, so wanting to keep risk management in context. So we're going to dive into detail on risk management today, but want to make sure that you keep in mind what Gloria covered earlier, that it is a dynamic part of an overall clinical QMS. It's part of that system, and it needs to operate in conjunction with the other pieces that are there to really get that comprehensive quality across clinical development. So just didn't want you to lose sight of that as we dive into more detail on the risk management part itself. So with that, risk management is defined in our TransCelerate framework, or in TransCelerate as a framework for preventing potential issues with the aim of avoiding unwanted outcomes. We'll talk a little bit more about those concepts. Unwanted outcomes is something you can define for your own company in your own way. I think ICH E6R2 certainly gives us some guidance as far as human subject protection and the reliability of trial results, and trying to make sure that we're protecting those. But we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about some of the benefits of risk management given that definition. So again, just in the context of the overall QMS, we're looking to prevent issues with the aim of avoiding unwanted outcomes. And you can see the value in that probably at face value, but there are some additional value drivers for having risk management in place. And again, beyond compliance, right? At this point under ICH E6R2, this is what we should be doing, looking at both a system and a trial level at risk management. But it also helps us to shift organization from reactive to a proactive mindset, right? What we're really looking to do is decrease that probability of any significant errors or events occurring. And you can see the link to achieving our strategic objectives. Obviously, if we have issues and errors and we're having to address those challenges are going to keep us from meeting our objectives. We also want to focus our resources effectively, right? So making sure that we're focusing on the issues that matter most, that we're looking at human subject protection, reliability of trial results, and however else you define quality in your organization, whether that's regulatory compliance, generally quality, public trust in the organization, right? That list can be whatever you think it needs to be in terms of your definition of quality in your organization. Next slide, Gloria. Thanks. So we did also just want to pause in a little more detail on the outline of risk management in the concept paper. And this is how risk management was referenced in the clinical QMS concept paper by TransCelerate. And all of that is still valid, right? From a best practice perspective, risk management has some general underlying principles. Having said that, with the advent of E6R2, which came in between the concept paper and the risk management paper, we've moved toward that more as the driver for our conversation. The language changes a little bit, but if you think about Q9, E6, risk management in other industries, they're all founded on the same basic principles and practices. And while we might call them something slightly different, really the important part is, again, getting that proactive look and doing the upfront assessment to help prevent things downstream. Next slide. So this is the framework in E6R2, and this is what we've built off of. So again, moving from the TransCelerate concept paper into E6R2, these are the concepts that we developed further in the manuscript, making sure we had some clarity around critical processes and data identification, risk identification, evaluation and control, communication review, and reporting. We don't spend a lot of time on reporting because that's covered elsewhere in terms of quality tolerance limits, but it is certainly related to our risk management conversation, where QTLs are a control for risks that we may have identified through the risk management process. Next slide. So all of those steps are an important part of our methodology, but they can't happen in isolation of other aspects of what's going on in the organization. And so we wanted to make sure that we're successful in our implementation of risk management. And just like implementation of any other initiative, program, process across any organization, there are some things that are important to making that successful. One of those, and a really important one, is leadership commitment and oversight. So we'll talk a bit more about that. You got a glimpse of the methodology, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. Communication, again, always important, and some best practices were highlighted there. And then periodic review to make sure we have that continuous improvement and organizational learning built into how we're doing risk management. That's a really important one from a risk management perspective, because we need to learn not only from the issues, but also from the effectiveness of the program. Next slide, Gloria. Thanks. So in terms of leadership, commitment, and oversight, again, these aren't things that you are unique to risk management, but they are really important to it. So if we want our risk management programs to be successful in our organizations, having strategic alignment of quality risk management with business objectives is really important. Maybe it even needs to be an explicit business objective, or maybe it's part of an overall quality-related objective, but certainly having that alignment is important and making it visible. Incorporating quality risk management into the organization's processes is a great way to have a visible demonstration of the value of that. So as an example, if a major initiative is happening, our leaders taking the time to do that proactive risk assessment up front and understand the impact on quality before they go to implementation. Risk-based decision-making that's evident in communications and actions. Communications are always helpful. Actions are even more helpful in reinforcing those risk-based behaviors. Resourcing, obviously we can't do without that. There's got to be some support for both implementing the methodology and maintaining the things that we need to demonstrate compliance. And last but not least, some form of oversight, and this really speaks to the review step where our risk management program meets the requirements, but also is effective, making sure that we're using that resource well and that our controls are allocated to the places where they have the most impact. So those are some fundamentals on leadership, commitment, and oversight. And with that, we'll move to the next piece of the puzzle on the next slide, which is methodology. We touched on this a bit on the slide on ICH E6R2, which really outlines the component parts that we need and the various steps. But really, for the most part, we start with identifying critical processes and data. And that's meant whether at the trial level or at the system level to help us look at what's really important in the organization to delivering with quality. At the trial level, that might be an aspect of our protocols that's really important to making sure we get our endpoint data right. At the system level, that might be something along the lines of informed consent is a really important process for us, and therefore we're going to focus a risk assessment on the overall informed consent process. That can be different for different organizations. It can be different for different protocols. That's all going to depend on the variables that make us who we are. The next step in the process is risk identification. There's a couple of things we'll talk about there, but we have more discussion later in this call about a risk library. So I'm going to hold on the details there, but suffice to say for the moment, you can use a risk library to help with risk identification. You can also just use open brainstorming. You can use a process-based approach where you're using something like a failure modes and effects analysis, or just stepping through the process one step at a time to understand where there might be risks. Once risks are identified, you want to move on to risk evaluation. What we put in the manuscript was an example of a way that you could do an evaluation of risk, right? The scoring, the table, the three criteria. The criteria of impact, likelihood, and detectability are pretty standard, but certainly each company can determine its own thresholds and whether it wants to use numbers or high, medium, low, but some form of evaluation to understand the relative significance of the various risks that are identified. Next slide. So we move from risk evaluation to risk control. And risk control is really a key part of the process, because without control or without understanding what your approach to control is, it's nice to have identified the risk, but you don't really get anything out of that process. So making sure you've selected good controls and that you've implemented them well is really what we're going to talk about in the next couple of steps. So there's a couple of choices you have once you've identified and evaluated a risk. And if you've determined that that risk is significant and you want to apply control to it, you really have three choices. One, you avoid the risk. You find a way to build that risk out of the process so that it doesn't exist anymore. That might mean that from a protocol perspective, you change the type of intervention that you're using. It might mean that you automate some part of the process. From a system level, it might mean that you apply technology to take variability out of the process. So you can build the risk out. That's great if you can do it. You can't always do it. Sometimes you have to go for risk reduction. And risk reduction is either decreasing the likelihood of the risk, the impact, if it's realized, or our ability to detect whether or not it occurred. And not surprisingly, there's a direct link to the factors that you saw in evaluation on the things that you can impact in terms of reducing the risk. And last but not least, you can accept the risk. So you can choose to go forward with that risk in place. But it's an important element of communication to the organization that, hey, we have decided to accept this risk. You can expect to see issues of this nature going forward in the process if it's something that's expected to happen with some frequency. So important, again, if you choose to accept risk, to make sure that's well communicated and understood to the stakeholders. Next slide. So documentation of the risk controls might seem really obvious, but we didn't want to omit it because it is so important. Documenting helps with a couple of things. One, making sure that the person who's responsible for the risk, who may or may not be a participant in a risk assessment, has that understanding of what they're trying to do. And just putting it in writing can be very helpful. Two, it helps with compliance. And I would suggest this is probably not a complete list of all the things that you might need to demonstrate compliance with ICH E6 R2. As a matter of fact, it's not a complete list for that purpose, but it certainly is one piece that you'll need to be able to show that you did put controls in place or what your approach was to the various risks that were identified. So the things that are on this list, I'm not going to read through the whole list. You can adapt your own. What we wanted to do was just make sure there was a suggestion of how you were addressing the risks that were identified and making sure that it connected to ownership and implementation and timing. Next slide. Similar to documentation, communication is really important, and it may, again, seem like a given, but without it, it's hard to say that the program is effective. So making sure that the relevant stakeholders, whether that's governance, or study teams, or process owners, anybody that's involved in the process, has heard the right information in terms of the risk management program. It might be at a program level, might be at a QMS level, might be at an individual study level, but being deliberate and specific about those communication needs, again, helps with the effectiveness of the overall implementation of the program and perhaps of the implementation of individual risks, so that folks understand the connection across the process. Next slide. And one sort of final and really important piece of a risk management program is periodic review. Again, this can look different for different companies. What we've brought back here are the concepts that were introduced in terms of leadership and the requirements from a leadership perspective. But this could, again, look different. It might include metrics. It might include trends across risks that have been used. It might include looking at which risks are most prevalent or most commonly used and different things like that to understand anything from whether your risk library needs to be updated, whether your resource allocation is effective, but really important to check in periodically and understand how it's working. Again, important for any program and any implementation, but also important particularly for risk management if there are newer elements that are being applied. So this particular approach would suggest we're looking at the strategic alignment of quality risk management of business objectives. So did we achieve that? Incorporating quality risk management into the organization's processes. Can we see examples of that? Looking for examples of risk-based decision-making, resourcing, and oversight are all one way that you can check in on your implementation. I think this is really at the QMS level, right, at that higher system level. I think there are similar questions that you can ask at the trial level as well. So periodically, if you have a trial that goes on for 5 years, you might want to check in every 6 months or every year, and just understand what the team has learned from their ongoing experience with that trial that may need to influence their risk management plan. And if you think about risk management as an imperfect science, right? We're trying to predict what's going to happen next. I wish we could always predict what's going to happen next, but we can't, right? We're taking an educated guess about what's going to happen. And if we get that guess right, that's great. But there are times when we're not going to, and we need to revisit our plans and make sure that we update them based on our experience with whatever the activity is up until that point. Next slide. So just wanted to round out this part of the discussion with a recap of what the most important parts are. So what are we really trying to accomplish with quality risk management for clinical development? We want to make sure we've identified the most significant risks at the trial level or at the system level, that we've evaluated and controlled those risks, so that we've made some evaluation based on the relative significance and controlled appropriately, that we've focused our resources on the things that matter most, and that, last but not least, of course, we've prevented issues. And issues related to human subject protection, whether that's rights, safety, or well-being, and the reliability of trial results are really the focus of E6 R2. You could, however, focus your attention on additional issues as well, if those are important to your organization. All right, next slide. So with that, we're going to go to Q&A. We have some time allocated for Q&A, and we have a couple of facilitators helping us with those questions. So hopefully you've submitted some questions, and if we have any, I'm going to look at the chat to see if there's any that are coming forward.
Melissa, I'd also like to just ask participants, I see a couple of people with their hands raised, and we're not using that functionality today. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and use the questions panel and type your questions into the question and click send.
Yeah, while we're waiting, Melissa, we did receive one question, and I thought, it's a very good one. So the question is really asking about what are some key success factors that we can use to measure the risk management process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So key success factors for measurement, depending on whether you're looking at, I think, the trial level or the system level, they might be different. At the trial level, you might be looking to connect the things that you've implemented controls around to the places where you have or haven't seen issues. For things that are at the system level, you might be looking at resource allocation as an example related to areas where you had historically seen risks. Those aren't the only things, and Alan, you may have some other things to add as well from your experience, but those are two that come to mind off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, obviously, when we talked about the definition, kind of going back, so if, you would do risk management right, ultimately it should lead to a decrease in issues, right? So, going back to, the intro slide, almost, what's different between risk management and issue management. Obviously, it will take some time for your risk management program to mature in your organization, but eventually, it should, bring value, and the value is, should be getting less issues, and, hopefully your risk mitigation plan, your controls are, put in place, so, you see a decrease in that, at least, the critical issues. So to me, that's, if you have the issue management program as well as the risk management program, they should, talk hand in hand. It's almost like a feedback loop. So, yeah.
Great. Are there other questions in the chat? And certainly if that didn't answer the original question, feel free to follow up in the chat as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions. Another one I think is pretty pertinent is the question talks about, is there a list of generic risks that all company, ought to track, or, is there like a list, I guess, that's common for all companies that we can, I guess the question is more talking about, as a starting point.
Yeah, so we put some examples out in some of the tools of what might be risks to consider. It's hard to do for all companies, and so we stopped short of making a list that we thought could be comprehensive for all companies, mostly because our companies are so different, right? So if you have an oncology portfolio or a vaccine portfolio, or you run phase 1 studies versus phase 3 studies, things look very different. So even within our own companies, sometimes it's hard to come up with a standard list that works for all studies. We've actually found we need to customize that depending on what study type you're talking about. So we don't at the moment have a list that's comprehensive to all. You could probably think of some topics that would be important regardless of the study type, and I would suggest that you explore those, and those would be things, to me at least, like informed consent, AE reporting, right? The things that everyone needs to do well, that have a lot of influence from multiple stakeholders. So I wouldn't consider that a comprehensive list, obviously, but I think if you're looking for starters, those are the types of things that I would suggest folks consider are the things that are pervasive across all of whatever kind of clinical trials you have at your company.
Yep, that's good. Okay, another question asks about really inspection. So the question talks about, have inspectors started focusing on company risk-based QMS approaches? So I thought that was an interesting question, because I know all of us have to deal with that. So.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm an expert on that, but I'll give you just my perspective. We've seen bits and pieces of this, but I don't think we've seen a comprehensive sponsor inspection on ICH E6 R2 yet. Again, I could be wrong, and if someone has different information, feel free to correct me. So I don't have any personal experience with that to share with you, but I think it's certainly fair game, and at some point we would expect to see that come up.
Yeah, I mean, just from my experience, obviously the concept of risk-based approach, that's a big hot topic. That's a buzzword. Inspectors are doing risk-based approach on inspections. Obviously, they have a program that's risk-based. So I think the concept is not new. Obviously, as far as ICH E6 R2, it is somewhat new. But if you look at the methodology and the whole just risk-based approach, it can be really applied, if you look at the framework in multiple things. So, they're doing risk-based approach. So it could be something that, they could be looking at as from a sponsor level. So it's important to be ready, obviously, and to show, due diligence that, it is something, each company is focusing on. It doesn't have to be a full-blown program, but I think it's important that, we're starting to look at that. And that's why, we thought this topic is pertinent, and we really want to have a position paper out there, making sure that each company is kind of trying to get ready.
Yeah, it's a good point, Alan. I think I was thinking narrowly of the risk management parts of E6 R2, but you're right. From a more comprehensive perspective, we have seen other parts get some attention, particularly around risk-based monitoring and things like that, and certainly the recent draft guidance that came out from FDA on risk-based monitoring and shows some of the thinking in that direction. So I think it's a watch this space.
Yep. Okay. We got a lot of good questions. Let me see what else we have. Another question asking about risk acceptance tolerance limits. So yeah, Melissa, I know you mentioned a little bit about risk reporting, and we only touched a little bit on our paper because there are other documents out there that specifically talks about that. But what's your kind of input in that sense? The question really talks about go ahead.
Yeah, so quality tolerance limits are a hot topic. I think there's a connection between risk management and quality tolerance limits that we don't want to lose. So making sure that folks understand that quality tolerance limits are a form of a control for risk, right? If you're identifying a QTL and you're saying this is something that we're going to measure because it could go wrong, that's really the back end of a risk assessment. So making sure that we're connecting the dots on those parts and that we're putting QTLs in places where they're going to be most impactful and doing it in a way that's respectful of resource, right? So you could do a lot of complex things around quality tolerance limits, but I think making quality tolerance limits that are clear and concise and to the point of we're looking at human subject protection and the reliability of trial results. One of our worst case scenarios might be something like you can't use the results of the trial because you crossed some limit, right? And that's really the worst case scenario type thinking that I think we're looking for with quality tolerance limits. So I think keeping them reasonable and understandable and to the point and connected to risk would be kind of my perspective on that. Alan, anything you want to add from your work at Amgen?
No, I mean, I think, you're correct. I mean, that's why we try to, have a reference to the position paper on, quality risk tolerance. It is a hot topic, like you said, but obviously, each company needs to define, their own, and then that's why we only have, kind of like a tidbit, paper. We don't want to, kind of steal the thunder on the other topic. But yeah, it is very much related to risk management.
And also, it's Gloria, if I could just jump in. There was a question about whether Transcelerator is working on quality tolerance limits, and there is actually a work stream that was initiated this year. I think the question was about standardizing them, and we're not a standard-setting organization, so we won't be setting standards, but probably what that group will do is develop some recommendations and best practices on quality tolerance limits. So just to answer that question as well, as there is a Transcelerator initiative.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and related standards, maybe just one more comment on that one. Sorry, can't help myself on quality tolerance limits. Related to standards, I think, again, it's something you need to test out in your implementation in your company, because we started thinking that there would be standard answers, and the more we get into it, the more we find that that doesn't always hold true. So I think having flexibility in your program to understand what those limits might be on a study-specific basis is an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, we have time maybe for one or two more questions. The next question I thought was very pertinent is, what are some major risks that you have run into, and then how have you resolved or mitigated them?
So that's a good question. I don't think, everybody's going to have their own definition of what's major. And we use a ranking that's numerical. So we have a value over which we say these risks are significant and we have to take action. There are some numbers on the scale at the high end that we see rarely that are things that sort of flag our attention as, wow, that's a really high risk we should look at more closely. But they really are case by case. And the ones that I think require the most attention are the ones where we are looking at the system level. And we're looking across the expanse of clinical development, whether it's a process or a vendor or an initiative, and making sure that where we have things that might be impactful to multiple trials or to all trials, right, are the things that we want to focus our attention and effort on.
Yep.
I know it's sort of a generic answer, but I'm also not sure how much specifics we can get into. I'm thinking back to that first slide that Gloria showed. So I think, I'll just generically refer to there are processes that are important to all of us in the industry, and making sure, we're doing things like informed consent rate and protecting subject rate safety and well-being, right? So that's something we should all be thinking about. Whether or not we see that as a risk, we should at least evaluate it. AE reporting, again, we should at least evaluate it. So, we're going to stop short of coming up with a standard list of answers or you should look at this because it's always significant, because it will depend on what controls your company has in place. But, there are some things that across clinical development we should all be thinking about.
Yep. No, very good. Okay, Laura, I think that's all the time we have, or do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I think we have until the top of the hour to continue answering questions. This will go till 11:30 Eastern.
Okay. All right. Let me see then. The other question we got was really more focused on small companies. So the question is really asking about, for a small company with limited resources, what is your recommendation for implementing a clinical QMS? So I guess how do we kind of get those small companies off the ground? Is there any kind of recommendations from that perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably the same answer whether you're a small company or a big company, but it's keep it fit for purpose, that you won't need to develop the same things that, if you have less than 10 trials in your portfolio, you're not going to need the same system level view that someone with hundreds of trials in their portfolio is going to need. But still, doing something, taking that step of moving in the direction of having a program looking at some significant risks, but keeping the focus on what matters most. And so if you lay out in front of whatever group you're doing a risk assessment with, hey, we're looking at human subject protection and the reliability of trial results, we need some cross-functional perspective on what might be important about, a protocol, for example, and focusing on a few things that are really important and seeing those through an implementation is far more important than having 100 risks identified, right? So more is not always better. Sometimes it's a distraction. Having focus on the things that are really impactful is probably that much more important for a small company where you're not going to have resources to go look at 100 things. Not that anyone does, to be quite frank, but making sure that, again, you're keeping that acute focus on the things that matter most.
Yep. Yeah, I just want to maybe chime in and say, if you look at the framework, it can be really applied. Melissa, I agree with you whether, you work for a big company or a small company. So, step one is, like I said, you have to identify your critical processes and, understand your, where your most significant risk lies, right? So it doesn't matter the size of your company, you should still have a list of what that is. And, obviously depending on the maturity of your QMS, you got to start somewhere. So, even with, a small company, I think, it's key to have good understanding of that and then, start putting them in the risk library and then, really walk through the process that's covered, in our paper. That the framework, I think it sounds enough that it can be really applied across and not just, depending on the size of the company, I think. Okay. The next question talks about for a risk-averse culture environment, we tend to manage too many risks. Yes, I agree. And so the question is not sure what the right balance is. So, again, Melissa, I think I will let you answer first, but I have my own opinions. But I think related to the previous question, kind of we discussed a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important for the folks who are implementing the risk management program to understand that, again, more is not necessarily better. When we talk about a QMS that's risk-based, right, we want to be focused on the things that matter most. And if you lose your audience on having to do too many things or diluting their effort to the point where they're not doing any of them well, or where they can't clearly and distinctly say, these are the things that are most important from a risk management perspective. These are the risks that are really going to prevent issues for us, and therefore we're going to invest our time and effort in them. If you're distracting from that by having lots of other things for them to look at that are not as important, that may not be how you want to implement a risk management program. So I think it's, again, always coming back to what are we trying to do? We're trying to protect human subjects. We're trying to protect the reliability of our trial results and keeping that front and center. If it's a risk that's not related to that, it may not belong in the conversation. And again, some organizations choose to do their operational risk and their quality risk together. If that's the case, I would suggest that you find a way to make sure that your quality risks come first or elevated to the right level, that they don't get lost in operational risk. There certainly can be some overlap there, so there is synergy to doing those things together, but you don't want to lose the essence of the quality piece and some of the other details that can surround it. Alan, you wanted to answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so that is a good question. How do we kind of balance? But kind of the way I look at risk management is just at a high level is it's a picture of a funnel, right? That's always kind of the picture that's in my mind. It's you kind of put all your risks or all your processes at the top, kind of into the funnel, and then as you go down the funnel, it needs to funnel out the not important processes or the less risk processes. So it kind of gets down to the fact that that's why we have a methodology to score. So you always start with everything and anything, or as much as you can think of. But then as you get down to the funnel, you really want to kind of commensurate based on risk, or focus your resources based on where the most critical risk is. So whether it's reporting out to senior management, or when we talk about kind of getting sponsorship, so when we filter out all those less risky areas, what's left is really, hey, this is the area we need to focus on and drive our attention to. So to me, that's the value of risk management is, we cannot avoid the ocean. We got to be focused and commensurate based on risk. So if we do it right, we should be kind of focusing our resources on that. Again, whether you're a small company, big company, I think resource is, is the key to any company, driving success. So to me, that's, where the value lies. And if we can do that right, I think, we'll get good sponsorship. So. Okay, let's see. Next question, talking about moving from a reactive to a proactive approach. Okay, what are some other aspects should we be looking at in addition to risk management? So, okay,
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm going to interpret that one a little bit, so hopefully we'll get the interpretation right. But beyond the formal risk management program that you might put in place for a trial, right, or from a system perspective under E6R2, moving that risk-based decision-making into our culture, I think is what that's getting at, and having those things overflow into behavior. So are we an organization that's really good at reacting to, oh no, there's an issue, all hands on deck, we can fix this, and shifting that resource to proactively, we figure out how not to have issues, and therefore we're much more planful, we have less firefighting, right? But that's a kind of a deliberate shift if you're coming from a very issue-driven organization, to make sure that you get the resourcing right, that you get the messaging right, that you get the sponsorship and the reinforcement right, so that the behavior you're rewarding is not, oh, good job fixing that, it's good job preventing that. So those are things that take time. They take cultural influence, they take sponsorship reinforcement, and I think that's what that question was getting at. I hope it's somewhere close to what was being asked. Alan, do you have a different or anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is more directed at, as like you answered, Melissa, like culturally, it's almost, it takes time, right? It takes time for an organization to be risk-based and to be proactive versus, kind of reactive. That's always, where I think traditionally we put our resources on, we bandage up the issue, hey, we have an audit finding, we have an inspection finding, let's go and fix it, let's generate CAPA and make sure, we fix it. But I think, from a culture, from a company's perspective, where do we kind of pivot and then go to the other end and saying, hey, risk management is really talking about being proactive, right? Not just sitting back and wait for something to happen. Let's look at it, and then hopefully, we tackle this critical risk, so it mitigates the issue. It doesn't, prevent it from happening. So I think it takes time. It takes time for maturity within your company to make sure we have that in place. So, being proactive, and then also, again, having the senior management buy in and say, oh yeah, this is value added. You're being proactive, and then, we are going to see value in the long run. So it is something a little bit difficult. I know some other questions really talks about, hey, how do you measure that? How do you measure like a good risk management program? What is the success factor? Is there like a metrics to measure that? It really, takes time and commitment, and then really see, the maturity of your program kind of going from its infancy and, kind of embedding it into your culture. So I think that's, yeah.
Thanks, Alan. It's Gloria. So I'm just keeping a track of the time. Why don't we go back to the presentation? We want to walk through our risk library and an example for the entire risk management framework, and then we can come back to some additional questions towards the end.
Sounds good, Gloria. Thank you. So in this section, we want to talk about risk library. And Gloria, you can go to the next slide. A risk library is not a requirement. It's just a tool that can help when you're conducting risk assessments to talk consistently about the things that are important to your organization. So it's not the be-all, end-all, and I think it's really important as we set out on this discussion on risk library that you don't want to end up in a place where your risk library is the answer to what are the risks. I think it's the things that you want people to think about when they're conducting a risk assessment that might be impactful based on what you know about your organization. And it just allows you to be a little bit organized going into that. So if you're starting from scratch and you've never done a risk assessment before, it might be too early to build a risk library. You might need to get some experience on a blank sheet of paper and then look across a couple of risk assessments and say, hey, we've got some common themes, or we've got some things that we see often, or some things that are really important to us that we want to pull into a risk library. And a risk library is really just a list of risks that help prompt discussion during risk assessment. So the idea is to group risk statements into categories, things that are frequently used, and have a common set of attributes so that you can sort of follow those through, perhaps get some trends around them, and give yourself that sort of head start on conducting a risk assessment. It summarizes some areas where you might have a system level risk that you want to make sure is addressed in all risk assessments that are conducted. And it might work from the other perspective, which is, something that you want studies to consider. And those may bubble up to be system level risks. There may be internal or external changes that prompt inclusion of certain things on your list. But it's never a list of every possible risk. It should be a short list of things with broad applicability. And then each specific application should have unique things to add to that as well for their own risk assessment. But it's meant to facilitate discussion and help identify risks, maybe support consistent approaches to evaluation and mitigation, and just promote an awareness of the things that might have broad applicability. Next slide. So this is a question just to gauge whether or not your organization uses a risk library or equivalent, right? You might not call it a risk library, but do you have a standard list of risks that you go to when you're conducting a risk assessment? So if you can give us a quick answer to this one, and then we'll share the results.
Thanks, everyone. It looks like we are up to about 50% of the folks on the phone have responded, so we'll leave that open for a few more seconds. All right, I'll go ahead and close that, and I'll share the results.
All right, so there's a pretty good mix here as well. Thank you, Gloria. So, for those who use it, it's just a reminder to revisit it periodically, make sure it's up to date, and make sure that folks who are conducting risk assessments are not getting lost in the library and remembering to maintain that perspective of looking at what's unique to their application. And for folks who don't have one, maybe something to consider. Maybe it's a way you add some efficiency to your process in the long term to be able to group some of those things together and have some standard responses. So the process for developing and maintaining a risk library, again, starts with identifying the risks. That may be done specifically for the purpose of, creating a risk library, or it may be that you've done a bunch of risk assessments and you look for trends across them and pull out what those common threads are. From that, you can create your risk library and use it and maintain it. So Gloria, if you go to the next slide. This is really the discussion about risks and identifying them for the library. There are a list here of triggers that might cause you to change your risk library, revisit it, create it. And I won't read through everything that's on the slide, but suffice to say, a lot of things, changes, new processes, or even never having done this before, right, could be a reason to look at risk identification through a library. Next slide. In creating the library, we'd suggest that you provide some sort of structure. And again, this is really where you get the efficiency for having a risk library, that you have some form of consistency around what you're calling that risk. So if you are identifying a risk related to an investigator site reporting AEs, that you have that worded consistently so that you can look at trends and things over time, so that if you have a standard control that you want put in place, that you can identify it there as well. If you have things that are common causes, that you can identify those too. And again, it's just meant to be an efficiency to help save time for teams that are going through and doing the work, and then for whoever's looking at the data later in the process. So including a description of the risk, the cause, so on and so forth is helpful there in creating the library. You're good, Clary. You can go to the next one. So the next piece in using the library, when you're going through risk evaluation, control, review, identification, right, all of those steps are linked to use of the risk library. Evaluation might include historical evaluation, relative level of risk. When you're looking at controls, you might be looking at only that portion of a quality risk management plan, talking to the risk owners about what are good standard controls for a given risk in the library, and maybe having an owner who's consistent as well. And that might be a function or an individual person, something of that nature. You can also use it during risk review and identification. So this can be part of the periodic review of the program to understand, are things improving? If you had something in your risk library and you haven't seen any issues and your standard controls are working, maybe that allows you to evaluate whether or not you really have that under control. And maybe that's not as significant a risk anymore, assuming those controls are maintained. But it's also an opportunity to add new risks to the library. And then last but not least, maintaining the library. So just like any other part of the process, there's value in reviewing to make sure that anything that changes over time gets updated. So that's a quick synopsis of a risk library. We did put an example. So someone asked earlier about what some standard risks might be. These, again, are not meant to be things that we would suggest every company has to have, but they're things that may have some common threads that you can look at and consider whether or not they're appropriate things to add to a risk library of your own. But it gives you also an example of, you would list the risk, the potential cause or causes, and the controls that might match up with those causes. So again, not going to read through this in detail, but this is one of the tools that's available on the TransCelerate website, and it's certainly available in this slide deck as well, if folks want some examples of the types of things you might include in a risk library. And these are just 3 additional examples. We're going to talk a little bit in more detail about the surge requirements not met for investigational product as a risk. And we'll get into that a bit in the example that's following the next Q&A. So this is just a visual of how a risk library might come together. So there are, risks in the organization that might be, again, standard, as we've just seen in the table as an example, where you might have a risk, you might have multiple causes, you might have multiple controls per cause. And then those are used to build the risk register or the quality risk management plan. You might call it something different, but whatever your risk assessment resulting plan is, that those would be one source of information. And then as you can see on the right, we're looking for, there are going to be unique other risks as well that should be considered as part of that plan. So some of them will be standard and come from the risk library or taxonomy, and some of them are going to be unique and will come from other sources. So those, may not all apply, right? You might look at, say, risk 1 applies, risk 2 doesn't apply, but again, it gives you some structure for what you might include in a plan. All right, next slide. So next we go to the risk management example. Just wanted to pause for a quick second before I dive into this and say, if you do have questions on the risk library, type them into the chat. We do have more time for the Q&A at the end, and I don't want you to forget your questions. But we are going to go through the example next, and so we'll come back for one last Q&A at the end. So we wanted to give you a sort of a walkthrough of, at the trial level, if you were looking at an individual risk, how that would play out in this process. So the risk is that storage requirements are not met for the investigational product. What that might look like in each of these steps is what we're going to go through next. So if we start with critical process and data identification, it may be, and this is a supposed example, right, that for this particular product, storage conditions are really important, and that if there's an issue with storage conditions, you have an issue with stability, and you have an issue with potency and those sorts of things. So if that's the case, this may be storage, right, might be a critical process, and data about storage might also be critical data. Again, might be, depending on how you define those things. So Claire, you can move to the next slide, actually. So this is a bit of an example on how we might build out the risk related to IP storage. So if the IP lacks the expected potency or contains impurities, or impact is the potential to jeopardize human subject protection, could also impact the reliability of our trial results, right? If our stability data is telling us we weren't testing what we thought we were testing in our clinical trial. There could be a number of causes. These are kind of superficial causes, right? You might, again, depending on what level of cause you go to, want to understand why those storage requirements might not be met during shipment. But it might be something as simple as, a refrigerated truck could lose refrigeration. And then you'd want to understand prospectively, what would you do, or how would you prevent that? And that's really the next step in the risk assessment process. So this gets you through identification of the risk, right? Understanding the impact and the causes. It also, as we talked about, might be a critical process, might include critical data. You can move to the next slide, Gloria. So from there, we wanted to go into the evaluation piece. And this really talks about, we're going to assess the risk based on its 3 characteristics of impact, likelihood, and detectability. And for each of those, in this example, we gave it a score. And that score was indicative of how that issue might play out. So in this particular case, we gave different ratings. Again, these are all made up ratings. This is not a real example, but hopefully you get the idea. And we set a threshold that said anything that's over 160 by our scoring methodology would require some sort of control to be put in place. So for the middle cause, storage requirements are not met at the depot, what we said was that although it's a high impact, we don't expect it to happen very often, and if it happened, we would detect it right away. So maybe they have redundant temperature measurement at the depot. Maybe they have, a person whose job responsibility it is to maintain temperature control. I don't know, right? But there's, for some reason, we've said occurrence and detection there are low. And for the other 2 areas, they're higher. And maybe, we've had issues with reliability of storage conditions during shipment. And even though we expect we could detect it, we don't detect it all the time, and it happens relatively frequently. So this gives you some idea of, we'd want to focus first and most resource on the one with the highest score. We'd want to understand why that was happening and put controls in place that help to address that. Next slide. So this next piece is really about then what. So we've identified what our potential issues are, or what our risks are, what our potential impact is, what the causes might be, and then we have to figure out what we want to do with that. So it might be that we have communication of what that risk is and what our controls are to the functions that are listed here. So it might be site study teams, quality unit personnel, anybody who's specifically handling the investigational product, that we're going to review periodically issues, risks, and understand, are our controls effective, and then where the occurrence of those different issues might be, right? So if we put our controls in place, and whatever those controls are, right, super redundant temperature monitoring and redundant cooling systems, or anything that might be relevant, did they work? Did they reduce the occurrence? Did they limit the detectability? Were we able to mitigate that? And so even though the impact is high, because you're not going to change the impact of an issue with controlling the storage conditions, but you certainly can prevent it from happening as often and improve your ability to detect. So those are the things that we'd want to check in on periodically and see if what we put in place was working. Okay, next slide. So the last piece is risk reporting, and again, this is one that may or may not be included in quality tolerance limits, right? It's hard to say how impactful it is, but I think you'd want to make sure that important deviations from quality tolerance limits are taken. So if this was one where we set up a quality tolerance limit around something to do with temperature, or humidity, or whatever aspect of storage is important, that we were watching that closely and understanding its impact on our patients and results. So in this example, a risk report would contain the risks identified, the evaluation, the scoring, and so on and so forth. I want to be careful, though, to distinguish the risk reporting that we might do internally around what that plan looks like related to the risk, and the QTLs, which are the regulatory requirement, kind of the more formal element of that. So there is a piece of reporting that might be informal in the sense that it's not required by the regulations, where we're looking at the details that are included here, but then there might also be a piece where we're more acutely focused on quality tolerance limits if they're applicable in this space. All right, next one. So with that, we go to our final Q&A. In this part, we have about 10 minutes left, I think. So we will take questions on anything. We haven't talked about questions yet, Alan, on the risk library or on the example. So maybe we can start there, and then if we have time, we can go back to other more generic questions.
Sure. Okay. We do have a question on the risk library. Let me just read it to you. It says, how do you best incorporate recurrent issues into a risk library? What framework aspects do you recommend?
So a couple things to consider about recurrent issues. If they are in fact recurrent issues, you of course have to look at your issue management side things first, right? So did your preventative action not prevent whatever the thing was? And it may be that you can't for some reason. So if that's the case and you want to take a risk management approach, you would feed that into, as one of the inputs to your risk identification process, that as a risk. So if it was a trend that you were seeing in your issue management process, you could certainly identify that either at the trial level or at the system level, depending on what it is, and include that for evaluation and potentially further control. So as an example, if every study is having issues with, I'll make up an example, getting documents into the TMS on time, right, and you're seeing that come up across studies, do you need to do something different in your process to mitigate for that as a risk? It's possible. But again, you can't forget, I think anytime you have recurrent issues, to make sure you're also looking at your issue management process. This is one of those places where that dynamic and the system that is the QMS is important. You might have to address it in both places to get it right, but I wouldn't say it's exclusively a risk management challenge. I think it's probably risk and issue management working together.
Yep. Okay, the next question related to risk library asks about what are some of the biggest pitfalls with creating and using a risk library. So an example that was given was, some risks for not making the risk library as effective as it should be, or
Yeah, the biggest risk I've seen with a risk library is that people stop thinking. So what you don't want to do is give a team that's conducting a risk assessment all the answers before they start thinking about what's important. While it's a helpful tool from an efficiency perspective, you don't want it to turn into the only answer, because certainly there are going to be things that are unique about whatever the topic of your risk assessment is that you'd want to consider outside of those standard answers. So I think you just want to be careful that it's not too lengthy, that people don't get lost in it, and that it's not required from the perspective of it may or may not be applicable to your particular application of a given risk assessment. So I think that's the biggest risk, is that you encourage people to use the risk library versus really giving some thought to what the unique and potentially risky things are about whatever it is that they're undertaking.
Yep. Yeah, I just want to add to that. I completely agree with that, Melissa. It's like, so we have to understand, it's a tool that, that should assist us in decision making and in, helping us to manage risk. But at the end of the day, yeah, you can't take the human factor out of our day-to-day kind of risk management practices. So yeah, just like any system that we use, I think, we can't just completely rely on it and say, okay, well, if it's not in the risk library, we don't really need to think about it. I mean, you still have to, have your antennas up and, make sure that, we do our due diligence and, having kind of our, eyes open and make sure that any critical areas we need to assess, we assess. Okay, let's see. The next question is not related to a risk library, but it's more talking about does Transcelerate have risk management templates or guidance on their website? Or do we recommend using the QRM paper, I guess, as the guidance or the template? So I'm reading this as, I guess, the impact, likelihood, and detectability template. I guess I believe that's what the question is asking.
Yeah, so there isn't a specific template on the Transcelerate site that we would say you have to use. There are some suggestions of the types of things that you can use, and the one that I've seen commonly used for risk assessments in general is a failure modes and effects analysis, which breaks down your process one step at a time, and it's kind of a structured brainstorming to ask the question, what's the risk, what's the impact, what's the cause, and then to do the evaluation and identify the appropriate controls. I would imagine you could find templates for failure modes and effects analysis pretty readily on the internet. but I would also say it doesn't have to be that that format either, right? You could use just a brainstormed list of what's the risk and what's the control, depending on the nature of the program that you have.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, just from, my perspective, just kind of add to that a little bit, Melissa. It's, yeah, like I said, it's, there are a lot of templates and, case studies out there, obviously, on risk management. So obviously, it does need to be fit for purpose for organization. But I think, the framework and, whether if you look at, the different guidance documents out there and what we have in our paper, I think most, I think, Eric, you can look at, they do use the three-prong kind of approach. You look at the impact, likelihood, detectability. Obviously, there is some flexibility on, scoring. I think in our paper, we use, kind of the four score grid. I know, for example, in my company, we use, 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So it's more like 5 scoring, and then, you multiply the three numbers, and you kind of get to your RPN score. So yeah, so there is some flexibility in that sense, but, I think the framework, again, going back to that, is, it is generic enough that, as a company, you can look into it and then apply it to your needs. But whether it's getting down to the detail of, hey, should I score this, from from 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 versus, high, medium, low, it's, it's really up to you how you kind of adjust that.
Thanks, Alan and Melissa. I'm just keeping track of the time, and we're just about out of time, so I wanted to make sure we could get these last two polling questions in before we close.
Okay.
Sounds good. Let's do it. So last couple of quick questions. Gloria's got up on the screen. Will the materials presented here today be helpful to you in your organization's risk management activities?
And just a reminder that the webinar, the recording and the slides will be available. I'll send those out to all of the participants, and we'll also post those on the TransCelerate website. Thank you. It looks like about 50% of the folks on the phone have voted, so we'll leave that open for a few more seconds, collecting the responses. All right, thanks everyone. I will go ahead and close that and share the responses.
Nothing like real-time feedback.
I know.
It's helpful. So thank you for and hopefully for answering honestly, because we really do want to know if this is helpful or not for the amount of effort we put in. And then the last question. There we go. Is how much value does this webinar provide?
Thank you, everyone. We're up to 50%. We'll leave that open for another minute or so. Great. Thanks, everyone. All right. And it looks like a good amount of value was delivered here today. So thank you, everyone, for dialing in. And as a reminder, all of our documents and tools are available on the Transcelerate website under the QMS assets. And we appreciate your time today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Gloria.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.